The summer of 1863 in New York City was not merely hot, it was suffocating, thick with the humidity of the Hudson and the heavier, more toxic miasma of political fracture. For 2 years, the Civil War had been a distant thunder, a series of headlines and casualty lists that, while tragic, felt abstract to the working-class neighborhoods of Manhattan. But by July, the abstraction had become immediate, personal, and violent. The Enrollment Act of March 1863 had transformed the draft from a theoretical obligation into a tangible threat. For the first time, men were being called by name, by lottery, to march to the front lines of a conflict that seemed increasingly fought by the poor for the benefit of the wealthy. The law contained a critical and deeply resented provision. A wealthy man could pay a commutation fee of $300 to avoid service. To the dockworkers, teamsters, and laborers of the Lower East Side and the 5 Points, this was not a law. It was a declaration that the war was a rich man's fight and a poor man's slaughter. The city was already a powder keg. Democratic politicians, particularly those aligned with the Tammany Hall machine, had spent months stoking the fires of resentment, framing the draft as an unconstitutional assault on liberty and the Emancipation Proclamation as a radical plot to flood the labor market with freed slaves. The racial tension was palpable. White workers, fearing that the end of slavery would depress wages and bring black competitors into their neighborhoods, viewed the war's evolving purpose with hostility. The stage was set for an explosion, waiting only for a spark. That spark arrived on the morning of Monday, July 13, 1863, at the 9th District Enrollment Office on the corner of 3rd Avenue and 23rd Street. A crowd had gathered initially to protest the draft, but the mood shifted rapidly from vocal dissent to physical aggression. When the police attempted to disperse the crowd, the violence erupted. Windows were smashed, the office was ransacked, and the draft commissioners were forced to flee for their lives. By noon, the mob had grown to thousands, swelling with the energy of unchecked rage. They moved through the streets like a tidal wave, tearing down telegraph wires to cut off communication and seizing weapons from armories that were poorly defended. The city's authority, already strained by the absence of thousands of police officers who had been deployed to the front at Gettysburg, collapsed. As the day wore on, the riot transformed from a protest against conscription into a campaign of terror. The mob's focus shifted sharply toward the city's black population. For many rioters, the war was no longer about preserving the Union or ending slavery. It was about racial purity and economic survival. The streets became hunting grounds. Black men, women, and children were dragged from their homes, beaten, and killed with a brutality that shocked even the hardened citizens of New York. The violence was not random. It was targeted, systematic, and fueled by a deep-seated white supremacy that had been simmering beneath the surface of Northern society. One of the most harrowing scenes of the riot occurred at the Colored Orphan Asylum on 5th Avenue. The institution, which housed hundreds of black children, was attacked by a mob that included women and children themselves, highlighting the widespread nature of the hatred. The rioters broke into the building, setting it ablaze. The children were forced to flee into the streets, some jumping from windows to escape the flames. The sight of black children burning alive or being hunted like animals became a symbol of the riot's savage character. The asylum was destroyed, a physical manifestation of the mob's intent to erase black presence from the city. The violence extended beyond the asylum. Lynchings occurred in the streets, with black men hanged from lamp posts and trees. Bodies were dragged through the mud, mutilated, and left as warnings to others. The police, who had initially been overwhelmed, eventually joined the fray, but their actions were often inconsistent. Some officers protected black residents, while others participated in the violence or stood by passively. The lack of a coordinated response allowed the riot to spread, moving from the Lower East Side to the Midtown area, and eventually to the wealthy neighborhoods of the West Side, where rioters looted the homes of prominent abolitionists and Republican politicians. The destruction was extensive. Buildings were burned, businesses were looted, and the city's infrastructure was crippled. The telegraph lines, already cut, remained down, leaving the city isolated from the rest of the country. The sense of lawlessness was absolute. For 3 days, New York City was effectively under martial law, though no official declaration was made. The National Guard, called in from Brooklyn and other parts of the state, struggled to contain the mob. It was not until the arrival of regular U.S. Army troops, fresh from the victory at Gettysburg, that the riot was finally quelled. The soldiers, armed with artillery and disciplined in formation, opened fire on the crowds, killing dozens and dispersing the remaining rioters. The violence ended not with a negotiation, but with a massacre. The death toll of the riots remains a subject of historical debate, with estimates ranging from dozens to hundreds. What is certain is that the vast majority of the victims were black New Yorkers. The official reports often downplayed the racial nature of the violence, framing it as a general disorder, but contemporary accounts and later historical analyses confirm the targeted nature of the attacks. The uncertainty in the numbers reflects the chaos of the event and the reluctance of authorities to acknowledge the extent of the racial terror. In the aftermath, the black population of New York City was displaced in significant numbers. Many fled to Brooklyn, New Jersey, or even further north to Canada, seeking safety from the white mobs. The community that had been a vibrant part of the city's cultural and economic life was fractured, its institutions damaged, its members traumatized. The riot served as a stark reminder of the limits of Northern abolitionism and the depth of racial animosity that persisted even in the free states. The draft was resumed shortly after the riots, but the event had a profound impact on the war effort. It exposed the fragility of Union support in the North and the deep divisions within the population. The federal government was forced to intervene more directly in local affairs, and the use of military force to suppress civil unrest became a precedent for future conflicts. The riots also highlighted the role of the press and political leaders in inciting violence, as well as the failure of law enforcement to protect the most vulnerable citizens. Memory of the New York City Draft Riots has been complex and contested. For decades, the event was often marginalized in historical narratives, overshadowed by the larger battles of the Civil War. However, in recent years, there has been a growing recognition of its significance as a pivotal moment in American racial history. The riots are now understood not just as a draft protest, but as a racial insurrection, a violent rejection of black freedom and equality. This reevaluation challenges the traditional narrative of the Civil War as a purely moral crusade against slavery, revealing the ugly undercurrents of racism that persisted in the North. The legacy of the riots continues to resonate. The issues of economic inequality, racial tension, and the right to protest remain relevant today. The New York City Draft Riots serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked hatred and the fragility of democratic institutions in times of crisis. They remind us that the struggle for equality is not linear, and that progress can be reversed by violence and fear. The scars of 1863 are still visible in the city's social fabric, a testament to the long and difficult journey toward racial justice. As the smoke cleared and the bodies were buried, New York City returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the trust between communities was broken. The war continued and the Union was preserved, but the cost was measured in lives lost and dignity shattered. The riots were a dark chapter in the history of the Civil War, a reminder that the fight for freedom was not just a military struggle, but a social and racial one. The events of July 1863 in New York City stand as a stark monument to the complexities of American history, where the ideals of liberty and equality were constantly tested by the realities of prejudice and power.